Colonial social services. Provision of social services during the colonial era. A number of social services were developed by different colonial powers in their African colonies. These included provision of Western education, medical services, water services, and housing. However, most of these were meant to make the lives of the Europeans as comfortable as possible. This does not mean that no services were provided for Africans. The Christian missionaries, in particular, played an important role in the provision of social services to the African communities during colonialism. Colonial education. One of the social services that had immense impact on the social, economic, and political lives of the Africans during the colonial period was the introduction of Western education. Objectives of colonial education. The Europeans introduced Western education in the African colonies for several reasons. These included: 1. They wanted to justify colonialism by introducing some aspects of Western culture, which they equated to civilization, and at the same time they assumed that their culture was more superior to the African culture. 2. Christian missionaries wanted to impart some level of literacy so that converts could read the prayer book, songs, and the Bible. 3. Some amount of literacy and numeracy was required among the Africans who worked as catechists, bookkeepers, and administrators, who could facilitate the spread of Christianity and the exploitation of African resources. 4. European powers also required African subjects who were obedient and submissive to the colonial masters. This culture could only be imparted through education. 5. There was a need to train Africans in technical skills such as carpentry and masonry in order to serve the colonial government's interests and those of the missionaries. 6. Africans were also to be trained in agricultural skills in order to promote white settler farming in colonies such as southern Rhodesia and Kenya. Features of colonial education. As part of the evangelization mission, the Christian missionaries introduced Western education to various parts of Africa. It was only later that the colonial government supported education. Mission education emphasized the 3 R's, that is writing, reading, and arithmetic, which offered very basic skills. The main means used by the missionaries to spread the gospel was to establish village schools in which children were provided with instruction. Brighter pupils were given further training so as to serve as catechists and teachers. Along the East African coast, freed slaves were among the pioneers in the mission schools that were run by missionaries such as University's Mission to East and Central Africa and the Holy Ghost Fathers, among others. Other pioneers in such schools included the orphans and Africans who were affected by African culture, like people with disability. In Western Africa, the freed slaves among the Creoles also played an important role in spreading Western education in the region. One of them was Bishop Samuel Crowther, who was ordained in 1864. He was instrumental to the spread of Christianity and Western education not only in Sierra Leone but also in other areas in West Africa. Colonial education in most British colonies in East and Central Africa benefited a lot from Ormsby Gore, the British Under-Secretary of State for Colonies. He invited governors of British colonies to London in 1925, and asked them to work closely with Christian missionaries in the field of education. As a result, government inspectorates were established in British colonies and subsidies were provided by the colonial government to promote education. Similarly, in the Portuguese and French colonies, missionaries played a key role in the provision of Western education. However, because of the assimilation policy that was employed in these colonial systems of administration, Western education was concentrated on a small section of the population, such as in the 4 communes in Senegal as well as in other urban centers in the colonies. Education in this case aimed at producing Africans who were similar to Europeans. Many elementary schools were established all over Africa by the 1930s, but the secondary schools and other tertiary institutions were relatively few. Many of the pioneer elites were also the children of chiefs and were groomed to take up leadership roles in the community. Among the schools established for such elites were Bow School in Sierra Leone, Achimota in the Gold Coast, King's College in Uganda, and the Alliance and Maseno schools in Kenya. In Tanganyika, such schools included St. Mary's, Tabora School, St. Francis, Pugu, St. Marian, Kalakula, and the Tanga School, among others. In Tanganyika, government schools during the colonial era were categorized into two, namely the native authority schools and central government schools. Central government schools provided education mainly to the children of chiefs, while the native authority schools provided education to children of the common people. The content of colonial education in general reflected the interests of the colonial state. Primary schools provided vocational education, particularly for the purpose of getting manual labor, while central government schools emphasized on industrial education or technical training. Higher-level education, on the other hand, emphasized on white-collar skills. In all the colonies, there existed a great disparity in the provision of educational facilities, as these were often provided on racial basis. For instance, university education for Africans was totally ignored in most colonies until the 1940s. In the Federation of French West Africa, there were less than 600 students in post-secondary institutions by 1934, and there was only one institution of higher learning known as École Normale William Ponty, which was based in Dakar, Senegal. There were no universities established for Africans in the Portuguese colonies. In East Africa, May Career College was the only institution that imparted higher education from the 1940s. Similarly, there was only one university college in the whole of British West Africa by 1945. This was the Fora Bay College in Sierra Leone. There were several reasons why European powers were reluctant to provide higher education to Africans. Firstly, they were afraid that educated Africans would resist racial discrimination and exploitation. Secondly, European powers did not want to spend a lot of money on Africans, as colonialism aimed at exploiting African resources. It is important to realize that colonial administrators had a few schools for the benefit of white children and in some places for Asian children. The European schools had the best facilities, but other races were not allowed to study there until after the 1950s. Such racial discrimination in education made Africans very unhappy and was one of the grievances that led to liberation wars in most countries of colonial Africa. European children were sent for higher education abroad, especially in the metropolis. In Tanganyika, European schools offered the best education, followed by schools for Asians and Arabs. The Africans received the worst quality of education. The colonial system assumed that women did not deserve to acquire the same amount of literacy as the men. This explains why few women got an opportunity to pursue higher education. Although most schools were run either by the government or by the Christian missionaries, there existed some schools that were financed and run by Muslim communities in different parts of Africa. These schools were prevalent in areas with large Muslim populations, such as along the East African coast, such as Zanzibar, in West Africa, and in the northern part of Africa. Role of Africans in the promotion of colonial education. It should be noted that once Africans began to appreciate the importance of Western education, they made an important contribution towards its spread. Those few Africans who received colonial education were employed in the colonial government offices. Their roles included teaching in bush schools that were started near mission centers, as the few missionaries could not cope with the demand for education. In many parts of the continent, Africans started independent schools where they imparted aspects of African cultural practices that missionaries opposed. For instance, in Kenya, South Africa, and Malawi, a number of independent schools and churches were started. Africans also demanded for better quality education from the colonial governments. As a result, some more educational facilities were provided to Africans, such as government secondary schools, which supplemented the efforts of the Christian missionaries in some parts of Africa. Africans donated land where schools were constructed. These were mainly in places where independent schools were established, hand in hand with the independent churches which broke away from mission churches. In Kenya, the Githunguri Teachers College is a good example of such schools. It was established in the 1940s in central Kenya. Other such schools existed in Malawi and South Africa. Impacts of colonial education on African societies. The impact of colonial education on African societies was enormous. Although this education led to the improvement in African lives in many aspects, it nevertheless fell short of making a large positive impact on most of the population. It left Africans with serious problems of illiteracy due to the small number that benefited from this education. For instance, there were only 5 African university graduates in Nigeria by 1957. The educated elites produced were alienated from the society. They imitated the cultural values of the European society and looked down on the African culture. This was notorious among the assimilees, where many turned their back on African culture in terms of religion, ways of dressing, music and dancing, language as well as eating mannerisms. The neglect of technical industrial education and emphasis on liberal and clerical training led to preference of white-collar jobs among the educated. It has also created contempt for manual labor and agricultural work, which has persisted to date. There exists a preference for clerical jobs, while manual jobs such as farm work and housekeeping jobs were escaped among many others. The use of European languages during colonialism, English, French and Portuguese, had prevented the development of official African languages that could be used as the continent's lingua franca. Colonialism condemned many aspects of African culture as backward. This led to the development of a mentality among some Africans that everything African is bad. This in turn had promoted preference of Western manufactured goods and culture, especially among the elite. Nevertheless, there were a number of positive contributions of Western education in Africa, like Western education introduced better hygiene practices among Africans, and this had been instrumental in improving conditions of living among the people. B. Western education was accompanied by literacy and training in numeracy. This has contributed to the general progress of African communities. C. The elite, who were products of colonial education, led in the nationalist struggle against colonialism, while Julius Nyerere, Robert Mugabe, Jomo Kenyatta, Nelson Mandela and Kenneth Kaunda, among many others, spearheaded the freedom struggle in their respective countries. D. During colonialism, Africans also acquired artisanship skills including carpentry, brick-making and other skills, which have greatly contributed to the welfare of the people. E. Western education also contributed to the eradication of some of the harmful cultural practices in the continent, for example, witchcraft and discarding of infants born with physical disabilities such as those with albinism. Activity 4.1. 1. Discuss the importance of Western colonial education in Tanganyika and Zanzibar during the colonial period. 2. Debate topic: colonial education had less impacts than benefits to Africans. Revision exercise 4.1. Section A. Write true or false against the following statements. In colonial Africa, education I. focused on the need to educate African women. I. created well-educated Africans. 1. Undermine the African culture. 1. Promoted African industrial and scientific skills. Section B. Answer the following questions. 1. Analyze the objectives of colonial education. 2. Discuss the role played by Christian missionaries in the provision of Western education during colonialism. 3. What role did Africans play in the spread of Western education in the continent? 4. Explain 5 positive contributions of Western education to Africans. 5. Explain the features of colonial education. 6. What were the 3 R's as used in mission education? 7. Who were the 2 pioneer groups that accepted colonial education in Africa? 8. Who offered education during the colonial period in Zanzibar? 9. Mention the only institution of higher learning in the Francophone up to the 1940s. Colonial health services. Colonial health services in Africa were developed out of necessity by the European powers. Objectives of colonial health services. Objectives of colonial health services could be summarized as follows. 1. European administrators and other personnel wanted to be protected from tropical diseases such as malaria, which had already killed a number of Europeans. 2. Europeans needed African population to be healthy for the efficient economic exploitation. 3. European colonial powers needed a strong African military for the defense of the colony. 4. To train medical personnel to handle Western medicine. Features of colonial health services. There existed many diseases in Africa even prior to the colonial period. They included malaria, yaws, leprosy, dysentery, yellow fever, smallpox, and sleeping sickness, among others. After the Africans were colonized, European powers did not concern themselves with African health matters immediately, although issues of health were a major concern to the military units. All over the continent, Europeans enjoyed better health services. They also enjoyed higher living standards. As a result, they suffered from fewer ailments as compared to Africans. The diseases that afflicted Europeans were also markedly different. They suffered from heart diseases and various types of cancers. Therefore, it was the Christian missionaries that took more concern on health matters. This was because the Christian evangelization missionaries encountered several challenges posed by tropical diseases. Indeed, several missionaries failed to resist tropical diseases while others were greatly weakened. Johann Krapf lost his wife and child who died of malaria along the East African coast in the 1840s. From around this period, therefore, a number of mission doctors arrived. In Sierra Leone, the first such doctor arrived in 1840 and there were several African medical missionaries from West Africa including Sierra Leone itself. However, during this period priority was to save the lives of European pioneers who were more vulnerable to tropical diseases. These included soldiers, administrators and missionaries. Medical services were also extended to African employees in the missions, African soldiers as well as those Africans in public service. In Nigeria, Western medicine was formally introduced in the 1860s, when the Roman Catholic missionaries in Abeokuta opened a hospital, known as the Sacred Heart Hospital. Mission-based health facilities were concentrated in particular areas all over the continent. For instance, in Nigeria most of them worked in the south because Muslims dominated the northern parts of the country. Similarly, in Tanganyika the German colonial government established Ocean Road Hospital. Ocean Road Hospital is one of the oldest health institutions in Tanzania, having been founded in 1895 by the German colonial government. At its inception the German government hospital, Kaiserliches Gouvernements Krankenhaus as it was then called, catered for the German community only. In 1920, the British took over the running of the hospital from the Germans after the First World War and the name changed to the European Hospital. The British colonial government followed the footsteps of their predecessors and adopted a policy that concentrated its medical services and facilities for the European communities. After independence in 1961, all the barriers from the colonial past were removed and the European hospital was renamed the Ocean Road Hospital to cater for all races. In the 1960s and the 1970s, the Ocean Road Hospital operated as a maternity wing of the Muhimbili Medical Center. In 1980, a decision was made by the Ministry of Health to make Ocean Road Hospital the hub for cancer services, whereby the radiotherapy unit of the Faculty of Medicine, University of Dar es Salaam, was shifted from Muhimbili Medical Center to the Ocean Road Hospital to give room for this expansion. Missions play the following roles towards the advancement of medical services. They provided training for nurses and paramedical personnel, such as physiotherapists. They sponsored basic medical training, and sometimes advanced training, often in Europe. In Nigeria, for example, the first Africans to qualify as medical doctors were sponsored by Christian missions to pursue medical training in Britain. They also trained midwives. Missions also trained Africans in basic hygiene, including the importance of general cleanliness, clearing bushes near houses in order to reduce the numbers of mosquitoes, as well as the importance of digging pit latrines. They built dispensaries, clinics, hospitals and maternities. Missionaries also provided Africans with vaccines and medicines. The European powers, having been challenged by the missionaries, came up with a number of methods to improve African health. These included improvement of sanitary measures in order to fight diseases such as malaria, yellow fever and sleeping sickness. A number of rural clinics were also established in various parts of Africa. In Nigeria, a dispensary was opened in Ibadan in 1904, while in Sierra Leone the government was awarding prizes to the chiefs in charge of areas with most improved sanitation. In southern Rhodesia, distribution of health resources followed a pattern of white settlement. Therefore, pioneer doctors were attached to the British South Africa Company. Priority was given to the health of the European population, although public health services were also extended to the Africans, especially those around European settlements for fear that they could infect colonial servants. In Uganda, a great campaign was launched against sleeping sickness, which was first diagnosed by Dr. Cook in the Church Missionary Society Hospital at Mengo in 1901. Given the large number of casualties from this disease, the government decided to evacuate thousands of people between rivers Nile and Kagera in 1907. In Tanganyika, the first hospitals were set up by Germans at the key military posts such as Kilwa, Iringa, Morogoro and Bagamoyo. The main objective was to cater for the health of the colonial military soldiers. During the First World War, a number of Africans participated in the war as carrier corps from British, German, and French colonies. Apart from suffering from various injuries from the war, many of them had psychological problems including dumbness, lack of hearing ability and lunacy. There was also a serious outbreak of influenza epidemic that killed many Africans. In response to the war casualties, the British government embarked on training African medical personnel. Some medical missions also established African units in order to cater for the African soldiers who were injured during the First World War. By the Second World War, a number of Africans had received training as nurses and midwives. Hospitals to cater for the African population were also established during this period. These included King George IV Hospital in Nairobi. Impacts of colonial health services on Africans. The government and missionaries in different parts of the continent established a number of health centers. These health services had a significant impact on African communities, which included 1. The services reduced the infant mortality rate in many places as midwifery and other services improved. The numbers of women who died during childbirth also declined. 2. Better hygiene practices and medical services also contributed to the higher growth of the population during colonialism. 3. Many Africans were employed as medical orderlies and in other departments that dealt with health services during colonialism. 4. The African medicine men and women found their roles threatened by the colonial health services, although they still continued to give services to those Africans who could not access services, especially in rural areas. 5. Health services were mainly concentrated around the urban centers. Consequently, this marked the beginning of unequal distribution of health resources between rural and urban centers in most parts of Africa. Activity 4.2. Debate topic: Colonial health services not only benefited the migrant laborers in plantations and mines but also the capitalists. Revision exercise 4.2. Section A. Answer the following questions by filling in the blanks. 1. The groups given priority in the provision of health services during the early days of colonialism were I. 2. 3. 2. Some of the medical services provided by missionaries during the colonial period were I. 2. 3. 3. European colonial governments promoted health services in colonial Africa through I. 2. 3. 5. Section B. Answer the following questions. 1. What were the objectives of colonial health services? 2. Explain the role played by the Christian missionaries in the provision of health services during colonialism. 3. Outline the contributions made by Africans in improving health services during colonialism. 4. Identify the diseases that commonly affected Africans and Europeans during the colonial period. Provision of water and housing services. During colonialism, the Europeans gave priority to their comfort in terms of provision of water and housing services. African interests were generally neglected with the exception of certain groups, such as those who served in the colonial military, mines and plantations. It was therefore not deemed necessary to establish better housing facilities and water provision for African communities. The colonial objective in the provision of water and housing services was guided by the following rationale. 1. The provision of water and housing services during colonialism was to facilitate the economic interests of the metropolis. 2. Provision of water and housing services during colonialism was meant to encourage the European settlement in the colonies. 3. Water and housing provision during colonialism was unevenly distributed depending on the economic importance of an area. 4. These services were provided on racial basis where the Europeans were given the best quality as opposed to Africans who received poor housing and water services. Distribution pattern of water and housing services. Most early colonial towns in Africa were dominated by political, administrative and economic functions. These determined the nature of housing and water service provided to the residents. In Africa, most urban centers were beginning to attract large numbers of Africans after the First World War. In southern Rhodesia, for instance, the number of African men in employment doubled between 1936 and 1944. A similar trend was experienced in other parts of Africa, including East Africa. The consequence of this rapid population expansion was the deterioration of living conditions for Africans and other non-Europeans such as Asians in urban areas. In Bulawayo, southern Rhodesia, some 4,000 African male workers and a known number of women and children were reported to have been housed in squatter settlements by the late 1930s. In Salisbury, Harare, the capital of southern Rhodesia, slums occupied by Africans were scattered in different parts of the capital city. In the 1940s, such slums were made using cheap materials including poles, grass and tins. These were nailed and tied together to form an African shelter. In Dar es Salaam, Africans encountered a serious problem of unemployment in the same period. The African population more than doubled, yet the number of houses did not increase. Consequently, African populations were overcrowded in small poorly built houses. In Nairobi, Kenya's capital, the situation was even worse. Many slums emerged at the beginning of colonialism. While the European population in Nairobi settled in better-drained neighborhoods, Africans and Asians settled near the Nairobi River where the drainage was extremely poor, giving rise to poor sanitation and consequent outbreaks of epidemics and diseases. Moreover, there was heavy overcrowding in the African and Asian residential areas, which contributed to the outbreak of bubonic plague in 1902 and 1911. Such outbreaks were unfortunately interpreted in racial bias. For instance, Africans and Asians were accused of being unhygienic and dirty. Consequently, one of the measures taken by the colonial authorities to deal with such outbreaks was to set the African and Asian premises on fire, for the purpose of eliminating the rats carrying the fleas spreading the plague. By 1949, the African population in Nairobi was estimated to be over 80,000 and was catering for more people than it was planned for, given that it was planned for about 50,000 people. Given this high population, Africans in urban centers suffered from several problems including unemployment, lack of proper accommodation, water shortage, diseases as well as racial discrimination. Interestingly, more and more Africans continue to drift into the urban centers all over the continent, especially from the 1940s, after the Second World War, due to the following reasons. Conditions of living in the rural areas were becoming difficult, especially in the white settler colonies, where a lot of African land was alienated. There also was great pressure for Africans to pay taxes. Yet, although urban centers were overcrowded, the wages paid there were much better than in the rural areas. Urban centers also attracted some Africans, as they appeared to offer a more modern way of life, especially among the African elite. In Tanzania, attempts to force Africans to grow more crops following the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 accelerated rural-urban migration. Improvement in transportation also encouraged mobility to the urban centers. The introduction of passenger buses and train coaches facilitated the movement towards the urban centers, especially in colonial Tanganyika. Another important factor that contributed to rural-urban migration in colonial Africa was the intergenerational equity and gender tension in rural areas. In southern African countries such as Lesotho, Zimbabwe and Swaziland, a number of African women were reported to have migrated into urban centers to escape from male domination in the rural areas. Most such women ended up cohabiting with males in the urban centers, most of whom had left their wives in the rural areas. This could also explain why women's migration to urban centers was discouraged by African elders who feared that many of them could end up either as prostitutes or concubines. In the urban centers. Between 1950 and 1960, the urban population of Uganda, Rwanda, Tanganyika, Zambia and Zimbabwe was reported to have grown by between 70 and 95%. In Nairobi, the population rose from 119,000 to 344,000, while in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa's population expanded from 90,000 people in 1938 to 795,000 in 1970. Although in the Francophone as a whole the situation on housing was much better for the Assimiles, in Morocco the main complaint was that the French spent more on the housing of 350,000 Europeans than for the entire African population in the country. Impacts of provision of water and housing services on Africans during the colonial era. The provision of water and housing services had a great impact on the lives of all the racial communities in Africa. Since most of these services were provided for the Europeans, most Africans viewed urban centers as places for temporary settlement, after which one would go back to the rural areas. The poor water services and housing available for African communities in such urban centers exposed Africans to diseases such as pneumonia, diarrhea and malaria. Many Africans lost their life as a result of the poor conditions of living. in colonial urban centers. Since the relatively large number of African men did not have adequate resources to accommodate their families in the urban centers, prostitution became widespread in colonial urban centers, leading to more social problems, including the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. Lack of adequate shelter gave rise to the emergence of slums, many of which have survived to date in many towns. This is where illicit activities such as the sale of illegal liquor, theft, and drug trafficking take place. The discrimination practiced against African communities, including lack of adequate housing and water, contributed to the emergence of nationalism against colonial injustice. In Kenya, the Mau Mau Liberation War had links with the slum dwellers of Nairobi. Inadequate provision of houses in urban centers provided an opportunity for enterprising Africans to construct lodging houses. Some of these entrepreneurs accumulated a lot of wealth, especially in West Africa and in Nairobi in East Africa. Towards the last phase of colonialism after the Second World War, better housing and water services were provided for senior African civil servants in the colonies. This in turn facilitated the creation of social differentiation in African communities. Racial discrimination in the provision of water and housing services contributed to the emergence of African welfare associations in urban centers like Dar es Salaam and Zanzibar. Activity 4.3. Discuss the motives for the provision and distribution of colonial water and housing services during the colonial era. Revision Exercise 4.3. Section A. Answer the following questions by filling in the blanks. 1. Were given priority in the provision of water and housing services in the colonial era in Africa? 2. Some of the reasons which made Africans to migrate into urban centers after the Second World War were A, B, C. Section B. Answer the following questions. 1. Identify the objectives of colonial housing and water provision. 2. Explain the problems encountered by Africans with regard to provision of water and housing services during the colonial period. 3. What factors attracted Africans to the colonial urban centers? 4. Explain the impact of the provision of water and housing services during colonialism. 5. Show how the provision of water and housing services facilitated African exploitation during colonialism.